All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Outperform this holiday season, testing for peak success. Just want to make sure we go over some housekeeping items before we start. So this session is being recorded. So make sure to send you a copy after this webinar. If you're having to jump out for a meeting anytime, feel free to do so. We'll make sure to get you the recording afterwards. If you have any questions anytime during the sessions, you can see that there's a Q&A box as well as a chat box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to pop the questions into either one, whichever one's easier for you. As always, if you experience any technical difficulties, if you have problems hearing us or seeing our slides, make sure to flag that for us in the chat box and we'll try to resolve any issues. And as for the questions, if you don't get a chance to answer them live today for you, we'll make sure we send you a personal follow-up. So anytime, just pop in the questions into the Q&A box and we'll make sure we get those answers out to you. So welcome back to all of our customers and users. We love having you here. It's always exciting to have you guys join us and share any feedback afterwards. If you're joining us for the first time today, welcome. I just want to share a little bit about SmartBear with you. So SmartBear tools are synonymous with quality across the entire software development lifecycle, from planning and design to testing and monitoring. We were founded in 2009 in Boston, Massachusetts, and we've grown to over 11 global offices encompassing North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Our users consist of over 6 million developers, testers, and operations professionals from 20,000 plus companies, including Google, Royal Bank of Canada, and Vineyard Vines. These kind of companies use our tools every day to deliver bug-free software. Our company consists of over 500 employees, and we also provide 6 free tools for the community, including the 3 wildly popular open source tools that you may all know and love: Swagger, SoapUI, and now Cucumber. So here you can see all of the SmartBear product portfolio. We span plan and design with Hip Test and Swagger Hub, create with Service V Pro, Collaborator, and Test Left, testing tools with SoapUI Pro, LoadUI Pro, Test Complete, Load Ninja, and cross-browser testing. We partner here with popular solutions like AWS and Docker and Deploy, monitor with Alert Site, and then we manage and analyze with Zephyr. So you can see any of these tools at any time on smartbear.com if you're interested in exploring any of them more in depth. So who are your presenters today? So my name is Mary Yen, and the marketing I'm also by two landed on the will actually give you a walkthrough of performance testing challenges on the API and UI side, as well as share some of the testing tips and tricks that they picked out during their careers here. Here's a quick look at our agenda. First, we'll start off by talking about digital performance as a whole and digital performance testing, why it's important, what's at stake when we don't give it our full attention. Then we'll discuss some common pitfalls we've seen across testing teams and how we can avoid them with certain best practices. And lastly, we'll show you how SmartBear tools can help through our in-depth demos. So what is digital performance? It's a measure of a company's ability to deliver a digital experience to an end user. In today's age, consumers always expect quality and speed all the time, and anything less will turn them away from your product and company. The most important factors that consumers consider when visiting your website or your application are uptime, speed, and functionality. Even if you think yourself as a customer on Amazon.com, or if you're on weather.com looking at the forecast for the next 5 days, you know what it's like to experience something when it's slower and not functioning correctly. So we're here to address those issues today. So just quickly, I know everyone are probably really familiar with these terms, but we want to make sure that we are level setting here. So load testing, API load testing helps us understand the performance of the various services behind the application and ensure they meet the required SLA standard when the application is stressed, while UI load testing helps us understand and improve the real end user experience when application servers are stressed. So what is the impact of performance? So you can see on this slide, I pulled some stats from Neil Patel, who's a big influencer in the digital performance space, as well as from SmartBear's state of testing for the past couple of years. Now, we all know what it's like to have a poor web experience, whether this page is taking too long or queries not returning what we expect. It can be frustrating. Even on the performance engineer side, all of the hard work and effort you put into ensuring that your end users have a good experience. So it's frustrating when something doesn't perform as planned. If we just take a look at some of these stats, 40% of people abandon a website that takes more than 3 seconds to load. 33% of people would consider switching providers permanently upon encountering any sort of quality or performance issues with third-party APIs, which is up 30% from our 2016 State of Testing survey. So these are pretty staggering stats. And if you're not already prioritizing performance testing, then these stats should give you something to really think about. Most recently, Amazon had their Prime Day from July 15 through July 16 this year. And already within the first hour, Amazon had, failed to perform under heavy load, with consumers complaining about the inability to add deals to their cart, which was resulting in high abandonment rates, as well as an estimated loss of millions of dollars in sales. Not only is the monetary loss staggering, but the negative sentiments shared by consumers on social media really damaged the company's reputation. So if we're all focusing on performance under load and we understand why it's important, then why are we still experiencing issues? Because doing performance testing is actually really hard and time consuming. So I'm going to pass this over to Nick, but before I do that, I'd like to run a poll and get a better understanding of who we have on the webinar with us today. So you could share whether you are responsible for both API and web application performance testing at your organization. Takes a few minutes to hit yes or no and let us know, are you responsible for both? Awesome. So it looks like we have a split between people who are doing just API or web application performance testing. The results are coming in. Awesome. So it looks like most of you guys are just doing one or the other right now. Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. So at this time, I'm going to pass it on over to Nick to take you through the API performance testing portion.
Thank you, Mary. Hi, everyone. This is Nick Bonifilio. I'm one of the solutions engineers here at SmartBear. Today we're going to be taking a look at Load UI Pro. So this is a module within our Ready API platform that is an all-in-one API testing solution that we offer here at SmartBear. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I do want to cover today. So a lot of these these challenges that we're going to be trying to overcome are going to be related again to API performance. But when it comes to API load testing, there are certain challenges that many teams face. So you probably have some experience running into some of these scenarios yourself. First challenge that we're going to address today is not folding load testing into the existing functional testing process. So if you're doing load testing separate from functional testing of your APIs, you're spending more time and effort than needed. There are ways within certain tools that allow you to extend your functional testing into load testing so that you can easily just translate from one to the other. So that way you don't have to create multiple different test cases and you can avoid redundancies. With Load UI Pro, what we're able to do is by tying that API functional test into the load test as part of the same process, you can easily take the exact same scenario, so all of your test steps. So if you have like a progression of API requests where you're passing data from one step to the next, maybe you're, for example, logging into an account and then maybe hitting the service for to return the account information for that account. You're obviously going to need to pass that data. What Load UI Pro allows you to do is take your SOAP UI Pro test cases from within your functional test case within Ready API, and then also use them to load test as well. Sorry. Okay. So second challenge here is just a lot of data that's not easily digestible. And it can't be shared amongst different teams. Now, every team, different information is going to be important to them. If you have, for example, testers, they're going to be more interested in like test data, failures, and that sort of thing. Whereas someone like a manager or an analyst might be more interested in failure rates, just in terms of like how often it's failing, not whether or not it's failing at all. You might run into certain scenarios where you might have like a engineering, like a development manager who's interested in, hey, I want to see specifically like the like a percentage of failures and that sort of thing, so they can get a much more like overarching number. If it's like within like a certain threshold or something like that. There's a lot of different people who may not necessarily want to save information. We and Load UI is going to give you a lot of different options as far as reporting, as far as which metrics are relevant to who, and ways of customizing the reporting that's given to you. Um, Third challenge that we may run into is specifically having to install your load tests on multiple machines just to scale them. So you might actually have to, in some scenarios, install some type of software or have some type of configuration set up within a network in order to distribute and run uh, concurrent hits from multiple different devices. But with Load UI, we have the ability to do that just directly within the tool itself. Um, Load UI is going to help us scale up very, very easily by adding in like the ability to control like number of virtual users. Do we want them to be concurrent, or do we want the hits to span out over time? Do we want it to be variable or fixed rates as far as like the number of transactions? We have the ability to adjust a lot of that directly within one tool from one source. All right. So what I'm going to do next is I am going to jump into the tool itself. And we're going to go through a few things here. So first thing that I want to do is I just wanted to go over how easy it is within the tool to actually take a a functional SoapUI Pro test case and convert it into a Load UI test case. So if we want to do some load testing on test case, all we have to do is find our test suite that we want to actually convert, right click on it, and we have this option here called Create Load Tests. Now what this allows us to do is easily convert everything over into a load test in Load UI Pro. So now that I have this set up, I don't actually have to create that test scenario all over again. So if I had a full, say like account, you'll notice it says account creation. This account creation has multiple steps in it. So you'll notice it starts a virtual service. It pulls up the form. It submits the account details, and then the service ends. So there's multiple steps involved within this test case. And if I go into Load UI Pro to that test case that I just created, you'll see the account creation test case is already here. So each time that I run this, we're actually going to get a certain scenario here where this is going to just be, this service is basically just going to be pinged over and over and over again for this. So just to give you an example, I have a kind of a sample that I already have set up that I know is working. So I'm going to run this one just to give you a little bit of an idea of what it's going to look like running live. You'll notice that we'll have this global metrics chart that will give us real-time chart data, as well as some table data down here in the test step metrics. So when I click play, this is going to play out over the course of about a minute or so. But we'll get some real-time feedback as far as how our performance is going here. So you'll notice with the red bar down bottom, still 0 on failures, nothing's failed yet. And we're getting a fluctuation on the amount of time taken for each transaction. But the number of virtual users right now is just at a very lowly 3, just to kind of give a sample here. But this will continue going for a little while here. And eventually we might see some spikes here or there in terms of the amount of time taken, but it'll all be it's all relative to like each individual scaling here. But when this actually finishes, what we're going to do is we're going to actually go through some of the other options that are available. Now, this is obviously if we're viewing it live. We can have a bunch of different configurations set up for what we want to be shown once it is completed. So when it's finished, we have the option to generate a report or examine statistics. I'm going to go with this examine statistics first. Click open. And what I can do is in this statistics tab up here at the top, before we were in this load tab, switch over to the statistics tab, and I'm going to add charts here. And I can customize these as much as I want. So this will give me just about any configuration that I can think of. So if I want to view the number of failures, I can view total or per second. If I want to, so let's go with total failures. Let's say arriving and running virtual users. I'm going to go with running virtual users. Total, let's go with assertion failures per second. Let's go with executed test steps per second. And let's, for now, let's click OK. Then we'll get a basically that chart back. Now this chart can be either scaled relative to like fitting or scaled relative to each other using just this little toggle right here, making it very easy to see the differences between like the actual ratios between the different items. But the main thing here is going to be these reports that we can generate. So we can create names for these. We can have multiple. So I can go in here and I can add another one if I want to add another one. I'm just going to choose this sample here. Let me click OK here. There we go. So I can theoretically go in here and I can choose like a number of different charts here. And I can set these all up, and these are going to be viewable by anyone who has access to the tool. These are also exportable, so if I need to export them, I can. There's a lot of different information that we're going to be able to establish from these load tests. We can set them up for our own use, for someone else's use, whoever needs to see it. We can create different configurations of these statistic groups for them. Another thing here is going to be the monitoring. So if we do want to have like more performance monitoring on like hardware, we can certainly set some of those features up as well using this monitoring section, as well as adding distribution as well. So if we are, like I said, one of the challenges here is having to install additional software and stuff like that on other machines in order to actually distribute tests the way that we want to. At a large scale, what we can do here is we can just add agents where we can supply our host and what port we want to send the information to, and then have that agent run the execution, run the requests from that machine instead of locally. And this allows us to just very easily set up exactly where we want our information to come from. So if we want, say, like, if we want to have like regional differences between some of the requests, if we want it to be like distributed by location, or if we want it to be distributed by like maybe a specific network or something like that, we have the ability to set that up. Okay, so now I'm going to pass things over to Elliot Landon. He's going to handle the UI side of things.
All right, thanks so much, Nick, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm now sharing, my PowerPoint about the typical UI performance testing challenges that a team faces. And there are some real challenges when it comes to performance testing on the UI layer. So first, let's consider the fact that script creation is extremely time consuming and requires loads of effort just to implement. So it can take anywhere between hours and days to write and run a script just for transactions. So if you're using a tool that requires dynamic correlation or programming for playback when scripting to capture client-side AJAX calls, you're ultimately spending too much time to verify that a simple recording can ultimately be used in a load test. Secondly, teams fall into the trap of taking too much time to transfer test data from the tester side to the development side. And so what this translates to is waiting for development to finish, and having this in place before testing happens takes even more time to test, identify bugs, and ultimately debug those errors and reiterate to get the best version of our application out to production. And if you're not using a tool that provides developer-friendly metrics that's actionable and easy to understand right out of the box, then you're spending even more time trying to translate that information for your development team. Lastly, if you're not testing in real web browsers that your users will be interacting with your web application, then you're really just providing an estimate for how your end user traffic would be. Performance testing at the end of the day is all about providing the most accurate model for how your end users would be interacting with your web applications at scale. And since real users use real web browsers, it's imperative that you have a tool in place that can do so. So the tricks here are to find a tool that can require no dynamic correlation or programming for playback, no scripting to capture client-side AJAX calls, and that we test early and often enough in collaboration with our development team. We test with real web browsers at scale, all to get a holistic view of how end users are interacting with our web application under stress. So doing all of these will ensure that you are preparing your application for peak success. And fortunately, here at SmartBear, we have a tool in place called Load Ninja that can help accommodate all of these challenges. So what we'll focus on in today's demonstration is, kind of going through the entire load testing process. First, starting with recording a basic user transaction, and we'll see how we can abstract all those dynamic nuances from the tester and play back immediately, and thus verify that a simple recording can be used in a load test scenario. We'll configure a configuration file where we will specify a number of concurrent virtual users for our load test run, and this will be using real web browsers at scale. And then when we run the load test, we'll take a deep look into the metrics, not only the duration-based timings that tell how users are interacting with our web application at scale, but also a breakdown of the navigation timings and the network timings, so we can understand how the network is handling our application. All right, so with all that being laid out, let's dive into Load Ninja. The first thing that we'll notice is that Load Ninja is a SaaS-based tool. So all we need is this URL, and now we can add as many testers and developers onto this single license platform as possible. So here within the user section, we can add multiple members of our testing team, multiple members of our development team, and when through the user settings, be given his or her own separate username and password credentials. And now in this manner, we can build out tests together. So there's no need to email log folders back and forth or recordings back and forth or interacting with a Git repository. Since all of our artifacts are stored here on the cloud, we can organize all of these artifacts or these web tests, the configuration files, and ultimately the results of those test runs into separate tabs here within a cohesive project file. So before we dive into the recording, let's take a look at our sample application that we'll use for today's demonstration. So it's a simple pet store application where we are looking to purchase different pets. A user can log in, search for a variety of pets. And that's what I want to point out here is, as easy as it is to open a separate tab and type in the URL, this is really the paradigm shift when it comes to recording or creating a web test within Load Ninja. So instead of mandating that testers have a extremely firm understanding of how the web application was developed, where session IDs are stored, or how objects are created, now we can shift the focus to just having a firm understanding of how an end user would ultimately be interacting with the web application and using that baseline knowledge to create a basic web test that will be used for load testing. All right, so again, just as we open a separate tab and specify the URL, we start with that exact same step here within Load Ninja. Since applications are responsive, we do want to have a feature in place that allows you to model how users are ultimately interacting with your web application or what resolution they're testing under. So because we're recording on a real web browser, we'll essentially see an embedded browser appear here within the Load Ninja recorder. This will enable testers simply to create scripts through no coded element and just by interacting with the web application as a customer or an end user would. So here we'll enter a username and password, sign in. We'll quickly do a log out and then navigate back to the home page. What I want to point out here is that we're not viewing everything based on the protocol level. So you aren't going to see a lot of HTTPS traffic. You don't have to correlate those get and post responses into the separate pages that you visited, because every time there's a URL state change, Load Ninja will log these pages as a separate step in the recording process and log all of the separate transactions or actions that took place on those respective pages underneath it. So after we finished recording, this is where challenges are, and most of our time in load testing is faced. So with a simple login, log out process, there was a session ID. And if we don't know where that session ID is stored right off the bat, then we have to take time out of the developer's day to talk with them and discuss where that session ID is stored. Now the tester has to go back, take that session ID, store it as a dynamic variable, and then propagate it from starting with the sign-in request where it was encountered to the rest of the requests until logout. If there's any client-side JavaScript, we also have to take the time to implement that in the recording before playback occurs. And ultimately, since on other tools, it's merely just an emulation of a browser, we have to ensure that we have a function call that clears the cookies and clears the cache every time. By using a real web browser within Load Ninja, we are implementing an entirely different tech stack that allows us to abstract all of these dynamic nuances from the tester. So ultimately, this translates to verifying that a recording can be used immediately after we press the stop button. So you'll no longer have to go through any code. You don't have to do any dynamic correlation. And because this is a real web browser, we can it's recording on a clear cache and clear cookies every time, and the tester doesn't have to do anything to ensure that those two response biases are in place. So we can see how easy it is to verify that a test can be used. We'll see that Load Ninja played back all of the pages that we visited and all of the actions that took place on those respective pages. And with the playback results, we can now see that all of the pages played back successfully. And once we have all check marks on all of the pages, we now know that since it played back for one additional virtual user, we can now use this script at scale for multiple concurrent virtual users. All right, so what you may be asking yourself is, hey, Elliot, you did a basic login, logout process. Now, what's the probability that we're only going to be testing, one username and one password permutation? And the answer is, not very likely. So in order to accommodate this workflow where you have captured user input, like a username, like a password, or what we'll show in another recording is how we can search for one specific product contained within the pet store, and how we can leverage the power of data-driven testing, upload a external data bank in the form of a CSV or TXT file. And if that file is filled with usernames, filled with passwords, or filled with all the products contained within the pet store, then we can mandate that not only that we can reuse this recording, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time and record a entirely new session just to accommodate these additional workflows to model our end user behavior accurately. So before I do that, the last thing that I want to point out on this login, logout transaction is also how we can accommodate, development, updated, development. So in other words, if our UI changes, if the login button changes location to instead of being in the header is now prominently featured in the center of the web page, we're still looking to interacting with that login button and go through a login and logout process. So instead of mandating that we reinvent the wheel again or record an entirely new workflow to accommodate this updated UI change, we can inspect that element within our updated web application, and let's interact with the updated optimized XPath, the XPath, or maybe the updated CSS selector. And what Load Ninja can do is provide that specific variable under the respective object identification mechanism that we choose. And in this manner, all we have to do is update the one variable and our script is maintainable and can be used for that updated UI workflow. Additionally, if any new pages come into the mix, we can easily accommodate that as well by recording new steps and inserting them as new pages in the workflow. Additionally, if new actions need to take place, we can record new actions on the individual step level. All right, so now let's record another session where we will be going through that data-driven workflow. And instead of leveraging or showing it with the username and password, we'll make a separate recording where initially we'll search for one specific product that the pet store contains, navigate back to the home page. And what we'll do now is we will add a data bank and upload a file from my local machine in the form of a CSV file. And then after telling Load Ninja how that file is formatted, either through a tab or comma delimited section, we can then review the import of all 16 products that are contained within the pet store, and those are represented through the 16 rows of data within our CSV file. So here is where we can take that initially captured input, whether it's a username, whether it's a password, or here, whether it's a specific product search. And instead of re-recording an entire session 16 more or 15 more times to accommodate all possible 16 searches, we'll map it to the respective CSV file that we uploaded and the column name within it. All right, so what we can do here, ultimately when we run a load test, it's, common practice to run on some sort of pre-production environment. But, ultimately the changes that need to be made to production are based on the results that we get back from pre-production. So since we're trying to model, the servers and the environment from production to pre-production as closely as possible, it might be prudent to run a load test once a quarter or once every so often on production, just to ensure that the results that we're getting back from one environment align with the results that we're ultimately basing those changes off of in our production environment. So if we recorded this in a pre-production environment, and which is represented through the URL that we originally input, if this URL here corresponds with a pre-production environment, then all we would have to do in order to make sure that this recorded web test can run in production or any other environment where we will be going through the exact same user transactions, is just upload a TXT file with that updated production URL. And in this manner, we don't have to re-record, and we can ensure that one recording can run in various environments. if we want to make sure that Load Ninja selects rows of data in a unique manner, or in other words, that when we run this load test at scale, no two users search for the exact same row of data at any given time, we would go within the playback settings. And this is where we tell Load Ninja how to select those rows of data from the uploaded CSV or TXT file. So utilizing the unique setting, this will help ensure when we have a set of username and passwords, no two users use the exact same username and password combination. Otherwise, we can select the rows of data in a random or just going down the rows in a sequential manner. So we also want to make sure that we can accommodate shift left mentalities, or those testing processes where we want to insert, small functional UI tests in the same software development lifecycle that load testing is done. So we can add these validations, and we have a couple of options here within Load Ninja. If your team is extremely proficient in scripting, since we're recording on a real web browser, we access elements from the document object model level. And just as you would open a browser console and script it within there, we can easily script it here within Load Ninja for the separate pages that we recorded. Additionally, if we want to monitor the total time spent on any one of the pages that were recorded and ensure that it does not go against the SLA validation provided here with this threshold, we can monitor this time during the load test run and ensure that when this runs at scale, that our SLAs are being validated in an appropriate manner. All right, so since we're accessing elements from the document object model level, this ultimately means that we can also access the underlying HTML. And here we can search for text that should appear or shouldn't. If you want to check for that dreaded 404 broken link error, you can make sure that that doesn't appear utilizing the page does not contain condition. And what we'll do here is we will set this script up to purposely fail. And the reason we're going to do this is that when we ultimately run this load test at scale, we're bragging about how we can get the developers involved at the exact same time that the testers are getting their data back. So we'll show what sort of tools and resources are available to developers during the test run. So we'll say check for golden retriever. And we'll note, because we implemented a data-driven workflow, anytime we're searching for anything other than a golden retriever, Load Ninja will log that as an error and report it in the virtual user debugger, which we'll see a little bit later on in the reporting section. All right, now that we have both of those recordings in place, now this is the configuration file that will designate how many concurrent virtual users we want to run in our load test. So what we'll do is we'll include two of the exact same transactions that we recorded earlier. And this is an interesting process because normally in the configuration file in other load testing tools, the tester bears the burden of the load generating agents. So what this means is that we as testers would normally have to use our own computing resources, our own system memory, in order to spin up the tools necessary that will ultimately emulate real web browsers. And so there's a couple problems with this. First and foremost, they aren't real web browsers. They're merely web sockets that are attached to a protocol-based recording that can, based on its ability to interpret get and post responses, emulates a real web browser. Additionally, this means that there's one more variable that testers have to account for. We have to look into the Java virtual machine. We have to allocate the heap and the memory and constantly monitor these resources to ensure that there's nothing wrong during the load test run. So now within Load Ninja, this is entirely abstracted and taken care of from the user or from the tester. So they're alleviated of this burden. And since we're providing the real web browsers on our side, there's no need to monitor your computing resources. And when we specify how many concurrent virtual users, this directly correlates with how many real sessions of real Chrome web browsers we will be using during this test run. So I'll distribute the load accordingly. Since I know for an e-commerce application, a lot of users are just searching randomly throughout the site and not logging in. I'll make sure that we model that behavior accordingly. Additionally, we can specify the server location. So this means that if we have international users, we also want to make sure that we take them into account because, if we want to not only make sure that US users are interacting with our web application, but we obviously have users from around the world, we include them in this model for load testing. So within Load Ninja, we have the ability to run duration-based tests as well as iteration-based tests. This just corresponds to whether we want to run a purely timed-based test or how many iterations that each virtual user specified in this load test scenario will go through. But for the purpose of this test, I'll run a 5-minute total duration-based test. This means that for 5 minutes, it will be running at the full 10 virtual user load that we previously designated. The ramp up time is the amount of time it takes to go from 0 to the total amount of virtual users designated. So I'll specify 1 minute of ramp up time. And if I want all of these virtual users accessing my web application the minute I press save and run test, then I would specify 1 here, and we can see that right away, all users will be released and start interacting with our web application. But if we want to gradually build up to that specified virtual user load, then we can add equally distributed ramp-up steps. And in this manner, gradually increase until we reach that 10 virtual user load. So this means that through 5 equally distributed ramp-up steps, every 12 seconds from time 0 to time 1 minute, 2 additional virtual users will be added. So if we want to modify the playback times or the think times that a user takes in between specific actions, we can override the recorded think times or that was made in each recording, and I can specify that here. So the error handling is a special section of Load Ninja where we can get the developers involved. If we encounter an error, we have 2 choices. We can either stop that iteration altogether or allow the developers to get involved and allow them to debug that error to get a quick understanding of what's contributing to the underlying error for a designated amount of time. So while that's spinning up, what I want to go through is the scenario where we may have multiple test runs. And this corresponds with a process where we're testing, in an agile workflow every so often or every time a new UI change has been pushed to production. We want to make sure that that updated version of our application corresponds with one that has an updated performance factor. So once we have multiple test runs in place, we can ensure that we can compare across past test runs and side by side ensure that the latest version of our application has all the improved performance metrics that we want. So similar to Load UI, we can specify only the metrics on the specific requests or the specific pages that we visited in each recording and only focus on those steps with those specific metrics. So since the sign-in process is visited in both of these transactions, I can compare across that past step. and select the corresponding times. So let's go back to our previous test because I think the results should be coming in on a live 5-second resolution now. So there were a couple of quick questions that came up. Where I work, there's a distrust of virtual users versus actual users. Are there limitations of caveats of virtual users? Oh, absolutely. At the end of the day, we use virtual users because if our application is looking to test 5,000 users, it can be very difficult to set up a process where we specify 5,000 real people interacting with our production environment from around the world. So in order to make a more economical decision, we have models in place, but with Load Ninja, when we specify virtual users, these correspond to real web browsers. So it is the closest possible resemblance to how real users would be interacting with our application. So one quick question that came up was, we want to load test 400 or 50,000 concurrent virtual users. Does Load Ninja allow this? Absolutely. We're specifying 10 users here. We can go up to 100,000, but for the sake of our very simple pet store application, we don't want to stress it that much, but up to 100,000 right now. So the first thing that I want to point out here is the virtual user inspector. So what this essentially offers us is a two-way glass into how users are interacting with our web application. So let's consider the scenario that if we had a physical product that we were manufacturing and we're looking to sell this physical product. Before we release it to the public, we go into marketing studio like the one where we're airing this webinar from. And through this two-way glass, we want to get a sample group of customers to see how they're interacting with that product before we release it to the general population. So this virtual user inspector is doing the exact same thing for our web application. This could be an internal application, and before it's released to the general population, we're seeing, under the stress of the total amount of virtual users we specified in this test, the number being 10, how time degradations would look from a customer perspective before it's released to the public. So now we know that, if an error does arise, which we know we configured one to purposely fail, they will be logged here within the virtual user debugger. And so we specified 3 minutes there. And so for 3 minutes, Load Ninja will hold that error-prone virtual user in place and allow the developers to access elements at the document object model level here through the JavaScript terminal. So using this, they can get a quick high-level understanding by pausing this error-prone virtual user and interacting with those elements through the JavaScript terminal. But at the end of the day, when the time does elapse, the only thing you will lose access to is the JavaScript terminal. It's just meant to get a quick understanding of what may be causing the errors. But fortunately in Load Ninja, you'll still have access to the underlying HTML, a screenshot of where this error occurred, and the network traces. This is an important waterfall view of how that shows how each element on this error-prone virtual user page was loaded. And so what I like about this is that we can break down and view the critical path and get a detailed view of the request, the response, a breakdown of the timings in each of their components, as well as the raw data and the HTTP archive report format that developers are used to seeing. So we spoke about earlier in the challenges that developers need actual metrics that they can use right out of the box. Here, while the load test is still running, we're providing these metrics and this format for the developers. So now there's no translation process that has to take place from testers to developers. And ultimately, developers don't have to wait until testing is done. This is all being done at the exact same time. So now they can get this information, go back to work, even while testers are getting more information of where bottlenecks may have occurred. So let's look at the charts now. So as I said before, these are coming on a live 5-second resolution. Similar to Load UI, we can specify the exact script that we've included in this load test scenario and look at only those metrics there. But furthermore, we can drill down to the individual step level and see how long that process took in comparison to the entire time a user would spend throughout the entire recorded web test. So the duration timings are great for understanding, bottlenecks on specific pages, getting a quick understanding of how users interact with our web application at scale. And the navigation timings help understand how the application is able to respond, either through the response timings or see how the network itself is able to handle the application at scale. This is extremely important information to have because at the end of the day, the error may not truly be on the developer's side. In other words, the developers may have scripted may have written our web application, almost in a flawless manner. And the underlying error lies with how the network is handling the application. So having these metrics appear at the same time as the duration timings now give us insight to not only understand how our internal team can accommodate and make up for any time degradations being experienced during the load test, but also bring attention to any external variables like a DNS server. If we see the sudden spike in our DNS time, we can take a closer look in the statistics, which shows the information in a tabular format, and now bring this information to our DNS server and let them know that maybe they're the ones that are responsible for the time degradation. So this helps ensure that not only we have all the information and all the insight required to make changes within our internal team, but to address any external variables that may be the underlying reason or the underlying cause of any errors for our load test. So this about sums up everything that I wanted to cover in today's demonstration of Load Ninja. Before we end today's webinar, just want to do one more quick poll. We did have a few questions that came in here. What we'll do is we'll make sure that we will respond with a personal email to each of these questions, and we'll make sure that we get those answered following the rendering of this recording of today's webinar.
All right, thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Nick. Appreciate both of your help on this webinar. So as Elliot mentioned, if we weren't able to get to your questions, and there are quite a few still in the Q&A box as well as the chat box, we'll make sure we follow personally with either Nick or Elliot taking charge, depending on whether questions are API or UI based. We do have one more poll asking if you'd like to talk further about your use case with any of our performance testing experts here. Whether it's for API, web, or both, let us know. We'll be happy to reach out. And if we could be of any more help, feel free to send us an email, and we'll make sure we respond as soon as we can. All right, thank you everyone for joining. I hope you found this information really valuable, and we look forward to delivering another valuable webinar to you again soon.